So we'll begin by saying that the shiur is Le'ilu Nishmat Avimori Dov Ber Meir Ben Ruven Halevi Imi Marati Rachel Bat Harav Michael, and happy Hanukkah to all. And interestingly enough, this happens to be one of those years where we actually read Shabbat Parshat Mikaitz on a Shabbat that is not Hanukkah. Happens it's one of those things that happens approximately once every 10 to 12 years on average, but often happens 3 times within a 10-year range and then won't happen again for 25 years. So it's one of those rarities of the calendar that we will actually read the Haftorah of Parshat Mikaitz this Shabbat, after last week having read the Haftorah of Shabbat Chanukah with Vayeshev. Now, because we're deep in the story of Yosaif and his brothers, and we're really in the story primarily at this point of Yosaif, tonight's shiur is going to be half about Parshat Vayeshev, half about Parshat Mikaitz, and it's really a continuation sort of last week's Dvar Torah, where I spoke about the travails of Yosaif and the question of how much of what happened to Yosaif was he directly involved and responsible for, and how much was more of him being acted upon, per se, if you will. And I think I want to continue that a little bit this week with a little bit of a twist. But again, I'm going to go to a screen share so that I don't have to pull up all of the Chumashim. And here's the screen we're going to share. Let's see if we can get it to work again. Okay, let's see what happens now. Okay, I am screen sharing, and you should see on your screen again. This is really the middle of last week's parsha. This is where Yosaif arrives in Egypt, and we're going to talk about Yosaif's period in Egypt, even though Yosaif, once he arrives in Egypt, is going to spend the rest of his life there, except for one short trip when he goes to bury his father. We're going to focus on the time he spends in Egypt up until the time the brothers show up. So that's what we're going to primarily focus on. And Yosef, I'm going to focus primarily on Yosef and his interaction with the Egyptian world, is what I would call this drasha. And we're going to speak primarily about the different people in the different stories where Yosef interacts. So if we think about it, there are really 4 perhaps sub chapters in the story of Yosef once he arrives in Egypt till the brothers come. Sub chapter 1 is he is purchased and becomes rises to prominence in the house of Potiphar. 2, he interacts with the jailer when he ends up in jail. 3, he interacts with Paro's 2 servants, the butler, the baker, and finally he interacts with Paro himself. And in each of and one thing I guess as part of his interaction with Potiphar, of course, is his interaction, of course, with Mrs. Potiphar. So if we look through those different sections in Yosef, I wanted to focus on how Yosef is in how Yosef's relationship with Hashem plays itself out once he arrives in Egypt, and that's really what we're going to focus on, and that's where the highlights are in what I'm printing out. So we find Yosef arrives in Egypt, and again we're going back to last week parsha. Yosef arrives in Egypt, and the first thing it says after it says where he ends up, it says in pasuk bet of parsha Lamites, immediately says Vahi Hashem et Yosef, that Hashem was with Yosef. Now again, Hashem, remember, always refers to Hashem midat harachamim. Hashem's mercy extends to Yosef and is with Yosef, and he is successful. And the interesting thing is, the fact is that Hashem's presence, or the fact that Hashem is present with Yosef, is even aware to Adonav. Even his Egyptian master can see, not per se because of anything. We don't know. It doesn't bring down anything Yosef says, anything in particular that Yosef does to cause everybody to be aware that Hashem is with him, but clearly um, his master can see that Hashem is with him. This is a very, very strange idea, although it's nothing that we can, it's nothing per se that's new, because if we think about it, we know that that even the Bnei Chet, in their interaction with Avram, say, Nasi Elokim ata b'tochenu. Yitzchak is told by Avimelech, Ra'inu ki haya Hashem imach. We could see that Hashem was with you. So we see that it's not something new for people in the non-Jewish world to interact with somebody who is clearly Hashem is with them. Clearly, Potiphar, Yosef's master, could see that Hashem was with him, and that Hashem matzliach biyado, that not only was Hashem with him, but Hashem was with him and caused him to become successful. Then, as a result of that, he gives him greater authority. And vayivorech Hashem et Beit Hamitri biglal Yosef. In verse 5, it says that Hashem, again, notice these are all Hashem. None of these are Elokim. These are all Hashem. Hashem has mercy on Yosef. He puts him in a position where everybody recognizes that Hashem is with him. And his master can see it. He's successful. And Hashem sends this great bracha to the house of Potiphar, just like Lavan himself says, Nichashti vayivrocheni Hashem biglalecha, that even Lavan was able to tell that all of the blessing that came to his house was because of the merit of Yaakov. So we see very interestingly that these people, by their personalities, by their way of life, by the way they lived their lives, were able to cause the non-Jewish world to realize something about Hashem. Very, very interesting. Now, again, we now have, of course, Potiphar's wife gets approaches Yosef. Yosef refuses. And here's what he says to her in Pasuk Chet and in Pasuk Tet. He says, now, interestingly, here he says, V'chatati le'lokim, not v'chatati la'Hashem. He doesn't say, I will have sinned against Hashem, but I will have sinned against God, the God of justice, the God of the powerful. Again, Kale, the word Aleph Lamed refers to power. So Yosef says that he will have sinned against the power of God by not acting appropriately. So therefore, he realizes and wants her to realize that this is not about anything about her. It's not that he's rebuffing her. He's saying this is impossible to be done because there is a God in the world. He is trying to, this is the only time up until this point where we've heard Yosef mention God, which is the first thing he says, actually. It's the first time Yosef is recorded speaking since he told his brothers the dreams, or I take it back, since he was speaking with the man about where are his brothers. It's the first time we have him speaking. And again, he is very, very forcefully showing that there is a God, that there is something more that we have to answer to. And he is trying to force this upon Egyptian society, even though concerning her husband, it seems he didn't even have to. Her husband was clearly aware of Hashem. Whether she was or wasn't is a whole machloket among the commentaries as to what was her rationale in approaching Yosef. That's a whole different story for a different shiur. But again, he says, "V'chatati le'lokim," I will have sinned against God. Then the next time we know the whole story. He ends up in prison, and again he goes to prison. What happens in prison? We look at Pasuk Chaf Aleph. Vayhi Hashem et Yosef, again, not Elokim, even though he says V'chatati le'lokim. Had he sinned, he's back to Hashem. Hashem is with Yosef, and again, he now finds favor in the eyes of the jailkeeper. And Ein Sar Beit Hasoro et Kol Me'uma Biyado Basher Hashem Ito. Basher Hashem Osa Hashem Matzliach. Very, very similar words to what we had above. If we go back up to in Potiphar, again, what? Hashem Ito and Matzliach. Okay, we have these two phrases repeating themselves both in what Potiphar saw in Yosef and in what the jailkeeper saw in Yosaif. This Hashem was with him, and through Hashem, Hashem sent him hatzlacha, sent him success. He is able to be the one. So there's clearly something about Yosef's demeanor, his personality, perhaps his choice of words, and how he lives his life that clearly demonstrates something that these Egyptians are not necessarily used to and expected. Okay. Now we continue on, and we now go to the story with the butler and the baker. And again, if we look at the butler and the baker, we know the whole story. Interestingly enough, the first time when Yosef introduces himself, he says he comes to them, he sees that they're downcast, they don't know what's going on. He asks them what's going on, and they say they have this dream, and Yosef answers them, "Halo lelokim pitronim." There are all sorts of interpretations available to God. Please tell me. Now again, here the choice of words, Elokim, and we're going to find now throughout the rest of the time, Yosef is going to be referring to Elokim. And here, perhaps, I'm only suggesting this, I haven't seen this in the version, but perhaps again, Lelokim Pitronim, because in each of these cases, the dream being a portent of some type of justice situation is what's why Yosef refers to Lelokim Pitronim, or the Torah says Lelokim Pitronim rather than Lashem Pitronim. The other reason, perhaps, is again, now he is talking to an Egyptian. It's interestingly enough, if you go back up to the previous chapters, when he speaks to Potiphar's wife, he says Lelokim, and when it's talking about an awareness, it talks about Hashem. It doesn't talk about Elokim. So again, here where he's speaking, he's saying Lelokim, perhaps because he does not believe the Egyptians understand the concept of Hashem as a the four-letter name Hashem, which represents Hashem as as independent of time, Hashem who is Hayahovah Ve'yihyeh. But they are aware of Elokim as a powerful God, God who has power to control the world. That perhaps they've heard of. And that's why, again, whenever Yosef refers to God throughout when he's dealing with the Egyptians, he's going to use the term Elokim. And we're going to see that multiple times when he's before Paro, which is the beginning section of the one chapter, the one paragraph that makes up parshat Mikaitz. Parshat Mikaitz is the entire Torah reading for the Shabbos is one chapter, one paragraph in the Torah. It's as it's written in the Torah. So Yosef, again, when he's talking to the butler and baker, he says, "Halo lelokim pitronim saprun ali." And that's the only other time. That's the only time Hashem is mentioned. After that, he goes in and he interprets the dream. We know what happens. Ultimately, he's forgotten for 2 years, and now we come to 2 years later at the opening of this week's parsha. Okay, and again, we know about Paro has this dream. He calls the wise men, the magicians, they can't interpret it. He calls Yosef is finally brought. And the first thing he says to Paro, and Paro says to him in Pasuk Tet Vav of this week's parasha, Paro says, "I have this dream, and ani shamati alecha limor tishma chalom liftoroto." And I've heard about you that you hear a dream and are able to interpret it. By hearing the dream, you're able to weigh the words of the dream, figure out what it means, and come up with the right interpretation. And Yosef immediately dispels Paro of any incorrect notion that thinks Yosef has any special power. He says, "Elokim yanet shalom Paro." Again, immediately introducing that to this Paro, again, who is not as accustomed to accepting God. He doesn't know anything about a God. He knows about his pantheon of gods, and he doesn't know about a single God who rules the world. Immediately, Yosef introduces this concept of Elokim as a powerful God who is going to answer and provide peace for Paro by giving him the interpretation that is suitable. Okay, Paro relates the whole dream, and immediately, as he's finished, he says, please, pasuk chavdal va'omar lachartumim v'ein magid li. I related the dream to my wise men, sorcerers, whatever we want to translate Chartumim as, the Ein Magid Li, and nobody could tell me what the real meaning of the dream is. And immediately, what does Yosef answer Paro? Chalom Paro Echadhu. He says it's one dream, even though it seemed like two. Et Asher Ho Elokim Oseh Higid LeParo. Again, this concept of Paro, you didn't have this dream because that's what was on your mind. You had this dream because God is telling you something. He's telling you what he's going to do. You are Paro, you are the king. This is very important that you must know that the reason you had this dream is because God is telling you something. He's telling you what's going to happen. And therefore, afterwards, Yosef is going to say, there's a rare reason. God didn't tell you this so that you can ignore it. God told you this so that you can save Egypt. That's the whole point here. That's Yosef's entire focus is this is a God communication directly from God to you in order that you, as the king who has the power to do this, will be able to save Egypt. Okay? And then he goes into the interpretation. And again, he repeats what he just said, except with a slight twist. Hu hadavar asher dibarti al Paro. This is exactly what I just told you 2 seconds ago, he says to Paro. Asher lokim oseh hera et Paro. What God is going to do, he's showing Paro. Now, again, it's interesting because there are two different phrases. One is higid lefaro, one is hera et Paro. One is higid, he told him. And the point is, one is referring to the 7 years of famine. Hera, he's showing him that in the future there's going to be 7 years of famine. Higid, he's telling you that 7 years of plenty are coming right now. So there's two different terminologies. One is higid, one is hera. But in both of these, again, this is supposed to be blue. Okay, in both of these, it's God communicating directly with Paro, that this was not just an idle dream that people that you might have had because you were thinking about, you went out to the pasture the other day and you walked past the cows while you were going to swim or whatever, or you were walking past the sheaves. That's not why. This is God giving you a direct message. Okay, so Yosef again is directly introducing Paro to this God, firstly by saying he is the one who is going to provide peace up front, Shalom Paro, and ultimately he is the one who is showing Paro what is happening. Okay, and then finally, he continues after the dream. He says, why, if they're all both one dream, why was it twice? Ki nachona davar me'im again ho Elokim umemaher Elokim la'asoto. That this is exactly, God is telling you exactly what's going to happen, and it's going to happen starting immediately, basically. That it's coming to fruition immediately. This is not some future dream about something that's going to happen in 20 years or 30 years. It's something that's coming down right away. It's going to happen. You need to be ready for it. And that's exactly what Yosef is telling Paro. Now, interestingly enough, Paro's response after Yosef says, here's what you have to do. Paro turns to his servants and says, Hanimtza kazeh ish asher ruach Elohim abo. Wow. Paro, remember, this is Paro speaking. This is Paro, the leader of Egypt, who himself, I am the God, and I am the one who the Almighty. He's the one who thinks he's the Almighty, the all-powerful one. Here he's admitting that there is this man has this spirit of God within him. Again, notice he doesn't say Ruach Hashem. And it's interesting that throughout this time that Yosef is in Egypt here, through all of these 3 chapters that we've just talked about, again, it's when somebody is speaking, the reference is to Elokim. When the Torah is describing the way they perceived something, it's Hashem. So there's a difference between these two different ways in which Yosef is introducing, if you will, God into Egyptian society. He is making, just like Avraham, just like Yitzchak, just like Yaakov, in their dealings with the outside world, are able to and are coming about by teaching the world about God. So too is Yosef in his way teaching Paro about God. And I think I'm going to stop the screen share at this point because now I'm finished going through the sources. How do I turn this off? Let's see. Stop screen share. How do I do this? How do I turn off screen share? Now, why do I do stop share? Here we go. Boom. Okay, now we're back to here. Okay. So I think the point that of this whole story in terms of the way Hashem and Elohim are introduced is to show us that there are two ways in which we have the ability to interact with the non-Jewish world, to bring God into the non-Jewish world. One is by teaching them directly through our words, but the more important one, I think, is by living a life, a godly life. And I think that's what Yosaif, what it's talking about when it says that anybody could see that this was somebody who Hashem was with him, that he was permeated, his personality, his appearance was such that people could see this was a godly person. And that's something that perhaps we are lacking today. Maybe we don't necessarily seem to be able to visualize that. Although there are people who we see and we understand when we look at them that this is somebody who obviously has some connection to Hashem. So the question is, this is a very wonderful story, and I think it's a wonderful lesson, and it's a powerful lesson. And I think one of the reasons why these two parashot are always the parashot that are read around the time of Hanukkah is because one of the I guess the most visible aspect of Hanukkah is clearly the concept of the lighting of the candles and Pirsume Nisa. And we always ask the question, Pirsume Nisa, this concept of publicizing the miracle, whether it's on Purim through the reading of the Megillah and all the other mitzvot that we do, or it's on Hanukkah through the lighting of the candles, is the primary or are the primary recipients of this Pirsume Nisa supposed to be the Jewish community or the non-Jewish community? And that seems to be a debate that both answers are. The answer is yes. The answer is both. Because there are cases where we look about it and the halacha says we're supposed to light the menorah, for example, in a visible place. Well, what happens if there is no visible place? Then we have to light it in a place where at least the Jews will see it. It's preferred that it should be in a public place where everybody will see it. But if that can't be done because of persecution, because you happen to live in a house that is situated in such a location that there's nothing that directly faces an outside street, then you light it in your house for the people inside the house. But it seems that if we look at the history of the halacha of the Hanukkah candles, the primary purpose of lighting the candles was supposed to be outside so that people who were passing by, who might not have the same connection to Hanukkah that you and your family who would be seeing it if it was inside have, that's also a critical component, a critical part of the Pirsume Nisa of Hanukkah. And so if we think about that aspect of Hanukkah and as being of course, as I said, the primary one, again, we're emulating the Avot, we're emulating Yosaif by bringing God and an appearance and an awareness of God to the rest of the world, to the non-Jewish world. Now, again, it's probably a lot easier to do that aspect of Pirsume Nisa when you're living in a non-Jewish society. But when you're living in a Jewish society, you still have this obligation of Pirsume Nisa to those Jews who are observant clearly, but even those that are not yet observant, we have the obligation to reach out to them and to teach them about that the lights of Hanukkah is Pirsume Nisa. And Hanukkah, unfortunately, is probably one of the most popularly misunderstood holidays, both in the Golah and in Eretz Yisrael, because we're not celebrating political freedom. That's not the celebration of Hanukkah, despite the fact that many people would like to have you believe that we're celebrating political independence and political freedom. That's not the case. What we're celebrating on Hanukkah is the ability to serve Hashem, to learn Torah, to keep the mitzvot of Brit Milah and Shabbat and Rosh Chodesh, which Antiochus tried to decree out of existence. That's what Hanukkah is about. The rebellion didn't start because they were under Greek rule or Persian rule or any other rule. The rebellion of Hanukkah started because they were told that we can't do mitzvot. And that's when we, the Jewish people, have to stand up and say, no, we don't care about the politics as much as we care about keeping the word of Hashem. And when we understand that, then we have come full circle and we are able to fully appreciate that the mitzvah of Hanukkah is exactly that. It's not to enjoy the light. We don't per se, we're not allowed to use the light. We have to see the lights so that they remind us of the light of Torah, of the light of mitzvot that was nearly extinguished, that we have to, again, rekindle every year, relight, re-energize ourselves in the observance of Torah mitzvot, in creating the light and of awareness of Hashem. And through that, we hope we will be zocheh to once again light the menorah in the Beit Hamikdash. B'mehera v'yameinu, amen. Comments, questions, feedback?
Well, that's all well and good, but like Rav Sobel wrote or said this week or last week, if you look at what's in Al Hanisim is about the military victory.
Yes, correct.
Okay? All right. So it doesn't say anything about what you said, right?
Sure, it does. Absolutely does. What was the military? No, hafuch. It tells us that. What is it? Who does it attribute the military victory to?
Well,
Al Hanisim. Read it. Who was the victor in Al Hanis in the war?
Well, the Jewish people.
No. God. God's the victor. Natata, you were the one who gave over the Rishayim Biad Tzadikim, the Zaydim Yad the Rabin Bad Matim. You, God, did it. We're acknowledging that God, that the only way we won the war was because of God.
Right.
So it is. That's the whole point of the Al Hanisim. Okay, is the Nisim. What Nisim? What did we do the miracles? Okay, we fought the war, but we only fought the war because somebody had our back. Okay, so clearly that, yes, that's an aspect of Hanukkah that we can't overlook. But clearly, unlike those who would like to say, oh, the Maccabees, they were strong warriors and they were able to whatever, and they were great guerrilla tactics and whatever. Yeah, all that may very well be true. But the Maccabees themselves, if you read Megillat Chashmonaim or Megillat, the stories about, you will understand that they themselves knew that by all rights and anything, any logic, they didn't have a prayer. They only had the only thing that they could count on was if God fought on their side, then they could win. And if not, they knew they didn't have a chance in anything. And that it was that emunah, that faith in God, that carried them through lots of lost battles. We only talk about the battles they won, but there were lots of setbacks along the way. And the entire, even though the miracle of Hanukkah happened at one point, there was no the Chashmonaim, the wars of the Chashmonaim go on for 10, 20, 30 years beyond that, beyond the miracle of the oil. They're fighting and till ultimately Shimon, the last of the Maccabees, ultimately is able to carve out some small degree of independence from Syria before the Romans come and take over the whole area. So there's a lot of, and while we talk about the Al Hanisim, yes, the Al Hanisim focuses not on the miracle of the oil. It's only a one-line afterthought at the end, but it tells us that the war that led up to the miracle of the oil was only able to be won because we know who was fighting on our side. Okay? And that was Hashem. Yes, the Maccabees did the official fighting, but it was clearly Hashem's fight. And I think if you had you taken a poll in June of 1967, you probably would have gotten a very high response rate of clearly God was the one fighting for the IDF in the 6-Day War. Today, that number could probably not be quite as high as it was back then, because unfortunately, as time goes on, that the absolutely miraculous nature of that victory, as well as the victory of the Chashmonaim, sort of dulls with time, and we forget that. Just like I think that's the same thing is true with everything, that everybody, you look at every war, whether it's the book of Yoshua, the book of Shoftim, book of Shmuel, every war the Jewish people fought, when they were winning the war, they clearly knew that the only reason they were winning the war was because God was fighting with them. Unfortunately, as we go over time, that realization dims with time, because we weren't there. We didn't witness the overwhelming odds that were stacked against us that we were able to overcome. And it's not once or twice. It's you go through every battle in Jewish history, whether it's, as I said, whether it's the 48 war, the 67 war, the Yom Kippur war. In every one of these, clearly the odds were so stacked against us that for us to survive was clearly a miracle. Okay, and that's my personal belief. Okay.
Yep.
Okay. Any other questions, comments? Okay. If not, I will wish you all